I really liked the design of this table, but the design made it difficult to clamp together. The hardest part was the bent laminations, which I like to call the double-tailed fish design. They are joined together here with a half lap and at that end with the half lap. And from the half lap coming out to where they go through the leg, they get wider and wider. And because of that, the mortise starts here at about 90 millimeters apart, and the mortise where they come through is more like 140 millimeters apart. What that meant was, when I went to clamp the long rail and the double-tailed fish bent lamination to the legs, it was impossible. It was impossible to get something this wide through two mortises that wide at the same time. And I couldn't separate them because of the half lap. But I got it done. I did the impossible. How did I do it? You'll have to watch the video. After weeks of planning and sketching, I came up with the final design of this floating top table. This console table is made out of two Australian timbers, Queensland maple and northern brush mahogany. Then it was just a matter of cutting, planing, ripping, docking, more cutting, and maybe some more planing, and all that noise woke Lola the shed dog. No stick figures were harmed during the making of this table. Well, apart from that one. I started by selecting and cutting the Queensland maple planks for the tabletop. I ran them over the planer to dress the edges and check the alignment of the joints to ensure the top will be flat. Then I set out the domino spacing and drew a smiley face, which is my seal of approval before cutting the dominoes. Time to glue the tabletop planks together. After adding the right amount of glue to all the right places, I hammered the dominoes in. Love that sound. Then a bit more glue to the remaining edges, and it's time to join them all together. Dang, don't you hate when that happens? After taking the top out of the clamps the next day, I ran it through the drum sander to flatten both surfaces. Then I decided to turn the sander off before removing the top and had to balance on one leg and hold the plank up with my foot. To reduce the bulk of the top, I cut a bevel on all four edges with the table saw. The bevel will improve the look of the floating top by increasing the distance between the rails and what you see of the top. I planed the saw marks off the bevel with my record 220 block plane, which my dad bought me in 1983. Then a quick coat of shellac to seal the top so it doesn't warp or crack while I start shaping the northern brush mahogany tapered legs. I tapered the legs on the jointer instead of the table saw. If you need a 600mm long taper, you make a rebate from the bottom of the leg and stop halfway at 300mm. The rebate is half the depth of your intended taper. For example, if you want a 20mm taper, you make a 10mm rebate halfway up the leg. Then just flip the leg 180 degrees, press the rebate onto the jointer table and run it through. If all goes well, the jointer blades will start the cut at the 600mm mark and take a full 10mm off at the end of the leg, leaving a 0 to 20mm taper over the 600mm length. Floating top table, I want the rail to be set down from the leg 25.4mm. And you could ask yourself, why 25.4mm? It's because that's an inch. and I want to keep everybody happy. I used the world's worst mortising attachment and cut mortises into the legs to take the long rails. I transferred the mortise position to each leg and repeated the process. Then I cut the double bevel on the top of each leg. I have to say, this came out pretty sexy. I cut the tenons on the table saw with the dado blade. If you look closely, I clamped a small piece of timber to the saw fence to stop the timber rubbing on the fence for the first cut. Then I cleaned up the tenons with a chisel until they were a snug fit. Ooh, did anyone notice my mask transition there? The hissing sound in the background is rain. Autumn 2022 was so wet in New South Wales. In case you ever wondered how much I take out with every cut of the chisel, let's have a look. In this case, around 0.2 of a millimetre, which is almost see-through. The tenons were a nice firm fit in the mortise, just leaving enough room for glue. The curved double-tailed fish rails were made up from 3 strips of timber each, which I cut on a table saw. I made 6 strips out of Queensland maple and 6 from northern brush mahogany. Once the 12 strips were sanded to a consistent thickness on the drum sander, it was time to glue them together in the curve mould. And now it's time to make a funky pattern with the glue, then spread it out with a roller. I used the cheapest rollers I can buy and tossed them in the bin after each glue up. Then I stack the strips in sets of 3 and separate each stack of 3 with painter's tape. You can see the white tape on the stack closest to me. The tape lets me separate the curve rails after the glue is dry. The next step is to clamp them into the curve shape and leave them to dry for at least 24 hours. You can see them spring back around 6 millimeters after the clamp is removed, which isn't a problem for this project, and they would make a good rocking chair. After flattening the sides of the curved rails on the jointer, it's time to set out the position of the rails on the legs. Off camera, I transferred these marks to the inside of the legs where the angled mortises will be cut. The mortises are cut on a 30-degree angle with my domino cutter, which I had to clamp to the leg to stop it wandering off. I cut 2 mortises into each leg. After cleaning up the mortises with a chisel, the curved rails are a snug fit. Even though I'm happy with the snug fit, it doesn't help with the impossible glue up situation later on. So I made the top mortise a lot bigger than the bottom mortise. Here's a sneak preview of how it's going to look. I have a family of crows living near my workshop who love to get into my videos. After marking out the half lap on the rails, it was time to cut them out with my Japanese pull saw. And here's a little bit of a montage of me cleaning out the half laps. In this shot, you can see how the half laps fit together at the end of each curved rail. Now it's time for the impossible glue up. Let's see how it was done. After clamping up the front and back rails of the table and setting them aside for the glue to dry, it's time to start on the shorter side rails. The top and bottom side rails are straight, and here I'm cutting dominoes into the end of the lower rail, which is pretty thin. Then I cut the corresponding dominoes into all 4 legs. Now it's time to glue up the side rails. At this stage, I'm glad I didn't try to glue and clamp all the rails at the same time. Having the long rails together at this stage made it a lot more manageable with one hand. That said, it was still a bit tricky trying to get them all to line up. Between the rails and the tabletop are 3 risers, which are joined to the inside of the rails with sliding dovetail joints. Here I'm cutting the sliding dovetail joints for the risers. And now it's time to trim the sliding dovetail joints to ensure the risers are the right height above the rails. You can see here how the risers slide into the dovetail slots and sit above the rails. This will make it look as though the floating tabletop isn't attached to the rails at all. After setting the riser height, I cut a curved section out of them on the bandsaw. This sets them back a little and hides them from view when you're standing close to the tabletop. Time to put it all together. I add a little glue to the sliding dovetails and drop the base of the table onto the risers and top. I added 4 temporary spaces between the legs and the tabletop to get an even gap. So this is where the magic actually happened. I wanted to make it look as though the curved rails, the curved interlocked rails, actually travel all the way through the leg, which really, when I'm putting it together, would have been impossible to do, because it's impossible to get the timber to go through there and there because it gets bigger, and also have it to a half lap here and down there that lock into each other all at the same time while trying to get them in. So what I did, I just made up some little blocks that give the illusion that they go all the way through. And it looks fantastic. Anyway, I'll glue it on and we'll have a look. So that's how I overcame the impossible joint for the curved rails on this table. Not what you expected? Well, I did say it was impossible, and the end result still looks the part. After hours of sanding and applying hard wax finish to all the nooks and crannies of the base, it was time to do a final sand on the tabletop.
No one wants to see you sand. No one wants to see you sand.
The tabletop had a nice stripe in the grain, and after 2 coats of shellac and 3 coats of hard wax oil, it looked fantastic. Here are some pictures of the finished table. Well, that's another project finished. I hope you enjoyed the build, and thanks for staying to the end. Remember to subscribe, like and share my videos, and stay well.